Next time you're ready to buy something on Amazon, use our special link by going to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. With books, movies, clothes, toys, electronics, and all of the other wonderful products that Amazon has to offer, you can make your regular purchases and help support the show. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon to make your Amazon purchases and help support the Wake Up Call podcast at no extra cost to you. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Professor Marjorie Cohn about U.S. policies towards the Philippines, cooperation between the governments of the United States and the Philippines during the War on Terror, and the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte. Marjorie is Professor Emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, where she taught from 1991 to 2016, and she is a former president of the National Lawyers Guild. She testified as an expert witness in July 2015 at the People's Tribunal in Washington, D.C. on crimes committed by the Philippine government. She has authored and edited numerous books, including Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues, a new edition of which will be published in March. You can follow her work at marjoriecohn.com. You can find her on Twitter at Marjorie Cohn. That's at MarjorieCohn. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Philippines. Marjorie, welcome to the show.
My pleasure, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So, a big part of this conversation is going to center around the human rights violations and the horrible crimes and war crimes and tragedies that we've seen take place in the Philippines in recent years. So before we get into the new president of the Philippines and before we even get into U.S. policies, can you just give an overview of what some of these war crimes have been in the Philippines and what conflicts are occurring in the Philippines that have resulted in some of these horrible tragedies occurring?
Yes, well, when I testified as an expert in July of 2015, the International People's Tribunal on Crimes Against the Filipino People included an international panel of 7 jurors hearing testimony from many witnesses both in the U.S. and in the Philippines. And the tribunal documented 262 cases of extrajudicial killings, 27 cases of forced disappearances, 125 cases of torture, 1,016 cases of illegal arrest, and 60,155 incidents of forced evacuation, many to make way for extraction by mining companies, and that was just from July of 2010 to June 30th of 2015. And that was those crimes were committed by the Filipino police, military, paramilitary, and other state agents operating within the chain of command. And the United States government aided and abetted those crimes by furnishing more than $507 million in military aid to the Philippine government, enabling it to commit war crimes. And in fact, in particular, for example, the United States planned and helped carry out the botched Macapagal-Arroyo raid in January of 2015, where dozens died. Commandos from the Special Action Force of the Philippine National Police entered this place where the separatist Moro Islamic Liberation Front had a stronghold, and the Obama administration had put a $5 million bounty on Marwan, who was a terror suspect's head, and U.S. drones actually identified Marwan's hiding place, led the commandos to it, and provided real-time management capacity for the battlefield operations. And Marwan was killed, but his finger was severed and disappeared, and then it appeared in an FBI lab in the United States, where DNA tests confirmed that he had been killed. But murder, torture, cruel treatment were documented, committed by the Filipino government. They all constitute war crimes under both the Geneva Conventions and the International Criminal Court. So those were just some of the the things that the tribunal found. And also, there was evidence that as part of the U.S. so-called war on terror, and I say so-called because terrorism is a tactic, it's not an enemy, and you don't declare war on a tactic, and yet we've seen in the United States the shredding of civil liberties and constitutional protections in the name of this so-called war on terror. And as part of that U.S. war on terror, in 2002, the Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo government created the Oplan Bantalaya, which is a counterinsurgency program modeled on U.S. strategies ostensibly to fight communist guerrillas. And after 9/11, the Bush administration gave the Arroyo government $100 million to fund that campaign, and then the government of Benigno Aquino III continued that program in 2011 under the name Oplan Bayan-Han, and it doesn't distinguish between civilians and combatants. In other words, it violates the Geneva Conventions and the International Criminal Court statute, which says that you have to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and you cannot target civilians. And this counterinsurgency program, Oplan Bayani-Han, has led to tremendous repression, including large numbers of extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, torture, cruel treatment. Many civilians, including children, have been killed. Hundreds of members of progressive organizations were murdered by Philippine military and paramilitary death squads, and particularly communities and leaders opposed to large-scale and invasive mining operations were targeted, and even ordinary people with no political affiliation. So this is some of what has been happening in the Philippines with the assistance and support of the U.S. government.
Yeah, and I want to pick it up on that point that you made at the very end about the assistance and support of the U.S. government, which obviously was a theme throughout your answer. And, of course, this idea is going to come up again when we get to the new president of the Philippines in a couple minutes. But I just want to ask you about this military aid that the U.S. government provided to the Philippine government and the support that the U.S. government provided. What did this look like before the War on Terror? Did we see a massive escalation of this during the War on Terror? And did we see anything different when the Obama administration came into office, or was it more of the same as what we saw during the Bush administration?
Well, it certainly was stepped up after 9/11. From 2001 to 2010, the U.S. government provided more than $507 million in military assistance to the Filipino government. Between 2010 and 2015 is when many of these crimes were committed by the Philippine police, military, and paramilitary. Now, in 2014, and this is, of course, under Obama, Obama negotiated with the Philippine government the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which gives U.S. troops the right to prolonged deployment in the Philippines. And it is widely, this Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement is widely seen in the Philippines as a threat to the country's sovereignty. And so it is not there are many military bases in the Philippines where U.S. troops would have access to, and this is not a popular program among the Filipino people.
Sure. And one more topic I want to get to before we move on to the current president of the Philippines, and that's something you mentioned very briefly in your first answer, and that's the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the existence, just in general, of separatist groups in the Philippines. So in particular, what is the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and just how prevalent are separatist groups and organizations in the Philippines?
It's a group that is fighting against the repression of the Filipino government. There are many other groups as well. There is the NDFP in the Philippines, the National Democratic Front for the Philippines, and that includes an alliance of trade unions, peasants, youth, women, national minorities, teachers, health workers, religious, clergy, includes the Communist Party and the New People's Army. Basically, this NDFP, National Democratic Front of the Philippines, is an alliance, and this is, I'm quoting from Just Peace PH, which is a an international platform that supports the Philippine peace process. And according to JustPeace.ph, the NDFP, the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, quote, is the alliance of progressive forces seeking to bring about fundamental change in the existing social system in the Philippines through armed revolution, unquote. There has been a civil war in the Philippines since 1969. There has been armed struggle going on between the government and opposition forces since 1969. There's fighting going on in the Philippines. A lot of people don't know that. The roots of the armed conflict can be traced to the colonial and neo-colonial domination of the Philippines by the Spanish, then by U.S. imperialism, then feudal exploitation by big landlords and capital interests in the Philippines itself, as well as bureaucratic corruption. And we're going to talk about President Duterte and some of his, really horrible policies with the war on drugs, extrajudicial killing, giving Marcos's ruins a hero's burial. But when he was elected in April of last year, and he won the election by more than 6 million votes, he openly declared that he was the nation's first left president. He called himself a socialist, and he cited peace as a top priority of his administration, vowing to engage in peace negotiations with the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. So he is very controversial. He's a mixed bag in the Philippines, although he's still very popular there.
Wow. Okay. And I know I said we would get to Duterte next, but I do want to get in one more thing since you mentioned Ferdinand Marcos in your answer there. And it has been over 30 years since he's been president of the Philippines. It might escape some people's minds just who he is and his significance. So can you spend a minute or two talking about Marcos and how he fits into how we should understand the Philippines today?
Yes, Marcos was a vicious dictator who ruled the Philippines with an iron fist from 1965 to 1986, and he ruled under martial law from 1972 to 1981. And during his brutal 2-decade regime, he killed more than 3,000 people, tortured tens of thousands of people, and stole $10 billion from the Philippines.
Next time you're ready to buy something through Amazon, go to our special link at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Whether you're buying clothes, toys, electronics, sports equipment, books, movies, or any number of other products, our special Amazon link at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon is the place to go to make your Amazon purchases. And particularly relevant for today's episode, you can purchase Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues, edited by today's guest, Marjorie Cohn, when you go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Make your shopping experience easier and faster and help support the Wake Up Call podcast by buying the stuff you're going to buy anyways through our link via wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon to make your regular purchases and at no extra cost to you. Help support the show and keep the Wake Up Call podcast going. Okay, so now let's transition into discussing the current president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte. And you talked a little bit in your a couple answers ago about who he is and some of the policies that he's best known for in the West and some of what might be his more significant policies in the Philippines. But can you get a little more into just who he is, what his crackdown of the war on drugs looks like in the Philippines, and how he is different from his predecessors?
Yes, he's a real mixed bag. He's a loose cannon. He is popular in the Philippines because he opposes foreign intervention, such as U.S. intervention, is really a Philippines first person. And there is some tension there because the military and the paramilitary aren't always on the same page as Duterte, and many of them are getting support from the U.S. government. But he has this vicious war on drugs where he's killed thousands of people, and not just him. I mean, a lot of them have been killed by paramilitary forces, so it's not clear how many people have actually been killed by the Duterte government. And these are extrajudicial killings. In other words, no due process, no arrests, no trial, and it's egregious human rights violations, war crimes. One really interesting thing about Duterte that I have not seen in a lot of the media is that he is highly dependent on the drug fentanyl, which is a very strong addictive substance that's 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine and has the same effects as heroin. So ironically, Duterte has this vicious war on drugs where he's killing thousands of people, and yet he is addicted to this very, very powerful drug. So he is, he's been criticized widely and justifiably so by the mainstream media for his war on drugs, but very little, I think, if anything, has been written about his political policies, the peace initiative, the negotiations with the NDFP, and also his opposition to U.S. interference in Filipino affairs.
Yeah, what if those peace negotiations looked like with the NDFP? Do you think there's any chance of actually achieving peace and ending this war, ending this armed struggle, or is that just a little too pie in the sky to actually think of happening?
Well, Duterte is the first Filipino president who has actually engaged with the opposition in peace negotiations. That's quite significant. There have already been 2 rounds of peace negotiations with Duterte and the NDFP since he took office. A third is scheduled for this month in Oslo, Norway. And in May of last year, Duterte claimed, he declared that he would release all political prisoners, which number more than 400, through a presidential declaration of amnesty, provided both houses of Congress approve. And 19 consultants from NDFP who have been involved in the revolutionary movement for years have already been released. Also, Duterte offered 4 cabinet positions to the Communist Party of the Philippines. Now, the CPP, Communist Party of the Philippines, declined, saying that they would not fill these cabinet positions until there was a comprehensive peace agreement, but the CPP recommended a veteran peasant leader who was appointed Secretary of Agrarian Reform and a veteran academic activist leader who was named Secretary of Social Welfare and Development. So there are leftists in his cabinet, and according to Luis Jalandoni, who is the NDFP's senior advisor on the peace negotiating panel, he says these are major appointments. I interviewed Luis Jalandoni at a conference of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers in Lisbon, Portugal last year, and so he says that the NDFP insists on addressing the roots of the armed conflict in order to achieve a just and lasting peace. And that's Jalandoni, whom I interviewed. The demands in the peace talks include the release of all political prisoners, land reform for the peasantry, which is 70% of the population, national industrialization to develop the economy using available human and natural resources, protecting the environment and ancestral lands of the indigenous peoples, and Philippine national sovereignty and abrogation of all unequal treaties with the United States. So it's quite far-reaching demands. Now Duterte, he has been very critical of the U.S. interference in the Philippines, but he was, I think, the first or one of the first leaders world leaders to congratulate Donald Trump on his election. So we'll see. It should be very interesting to see what kind of a relationship Duterte forges with Trump. And Duterte, as he has moved away from, wanting to move away from U.S. Involvement in the Philippines, Duterte said, quote, "I will break up with America. I would rather go to Russia and to China," unquote. And Duterte vowed to rescind joint patrols with U.S. and Filipino forces against Chinese expansion in the disputed South China Sea, and he recently traveled to China and secured valuable fishing rights for the Filipinos in the South China Sea. Of course, Donald Trump has been very critical of China. He's been, praised Russia and said he wants to tamp down the Cold War, but he has been said some pretty hostile things about China. So the geopolitics of these relationships is going to be quite interesting after Trump becomes president.
Sure, it definitely will be. And with Duterte and Trump seemingly being quite different in many respects than their predecessors, it'll definitely be interesting to see what happens and how the geopolitics between the Philippines and the United States, and as well with China's role in this situation, how that plays out. So thank you very much for joining me today. If there's anything else you'd like to say about Duterte and the foreign policy, then go for it. But also, what are the best ways to follow your work? And can you take about 30 seconds to a minute to talk about that book, Drones and Targeted Killing, that I mentioned briefly in the introduction?
Well, I just wanted to say that Duterte said, I am not a fan of the Americans. Filipinos should be first before everybody else. In our relations to the world, the Philippines will pursue an independent foreign policy. He said the United States has not apologized for the atrocities it committed against the Filipino people. And then when the U.S. criticized him for human rights violations, he said, why are you Americans killing the black people there, shooting them down when they're already on the ground? Duterte promised to end joint military maneuvers with U.S. forces and expel the hundreds of U.S. troops currently stationed in the Philippines, and also expressed his intention to end bilateral agreements concluded by his predecessor with the United States and reverse permission for the United States' use of 5 Philippine military bases. Now, once again, as I said, we'll see if his relationship with Donald Trump changes those goals of Duterte at all. But meanwhile, yes, my website is marjoriecohn.com, and I have written about the Philippines, couple of articles, 2 or 3 articles actually, that some of which is reflected in the interview today, and also my videos and books are listed there. My most recent book is Drones and Targeted Killing: Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues, and the second edition will be published in March of this year, Drones and Targeted Killing. And if you go to my website, marjoriecohn.com, you'll see right away there will be a link to that book, and you can read about it.
Okay, great. And of course, the show notes page for today's episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/Philippines. And there will be links to marjoriecohn.com and the appropriate Twitter account, and to that book, Drones and Targeted Killing, and to a few articles on the Philippines. So the place to go for resources related to today's episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/Philippines. And I want to encourage everybody, while you're on our website, to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher, so that you can get all the episodes and stay up to date and not miss any. And Marjorie, thank you so much for your time today and for joining me to discuss what's been going on in the Philippines and to discuss Duterte. And I hope that we're able to speak again sometime in the future, whether it be about the Philippines or drones or some other topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adam. Take care.
All right, you too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.